So today's program is going to be about the U.S. government's Countering Violent Extremism program, also known as CVE. Now, we have a special guest with us here today that's going to be talking about this program. But just to get a feel from the audience, how many of you have heard of the CVE program prior to you hearing about this event? Just raise your hand. Okay. How many of you, after hearing about this event, heard about the CVE program and kind of researched it, looked it up a little bit? A few people. Okay. All right, so I'm not going to give you an overview because we have an expert with us today who's going to be explaining what it is. And there's been several discussions in the Muslim community ever since we heard, the Muslim community has heard about this program. There's actually been some resolutions that have been passed by local Muslim organizations as well as national Muslim and non-Muslim organizations, which probably, Mr. Mike German can speak more to, or we can address it at the end. But let me introduce our guest speaker. Michael German is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. So he's there currently right now at the Brennan Center, which seeks to ensure that our government respects human rights and fundamental freedoms in conducting the fight against terrorism. So most of his work focuses on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. So about his background a little bit, prior to joining the Brennan Center, Mr. German served as the Policy Counsel for National Security and Privacy for the American Civil Liberties Union, Washington Legislative Office. He's been a 16-year veteran of federal law enforcement. Mr. German served as a special agent with the FBI, where he specialized in domestic terrorism and covert operations. He was an undercover agent, and he twice infiltrated extremist groups using constitutionally sound law enforcement techniques. So these operations successfully prevented real terrorist attacks by winning criminal convictions against terrorists. He also served as a counterterrorism instructor at the FBI National Academy. And at the academy, he used to teach courses on extremism in democratic societies. And he also developed a graduate level training program for state, local, and international enforcement officers. So he's quite well accomplished. Mr. German left the FBI in 2004 after he reported continuing deficiencies in FBI counterterrorism operations to Congress. Then he started lecturing on counterterrorism and intelligence matters, and he served as an adjunct professor for law enforcement and terrorism at the National Defense University. He joined the ACLU Washington Legislative Office staff in 2006. Mr. German is the author of scholarly articles including Squaring the Error, published by Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College, and Trying Enemy Combatants in Civilian Courts, published by George Washington Law Review. His first book is called Thinking Like a Terrorist, Insights of a Former FBI Undercover Agent, and that book was published in 2007. So currently he serves on the Constitution Project's Liberty and Security Committee and is a senior fellow with globalsecurity.org. Mr. German graduated from Northwestern University Law School, and he graduated cum laude from Wake Forest University with a BA in philosophy. So to clarify, as you can see, he's got a lot of credentials to his backing, and this is a man who definitely knows the subject. So we could have brought in one of our local Muslim leaders to come and talk to you here about what they think about CVE or which direction it should be heading in. We specifically chose Mr. German because you can see the background that he has, and this is what he does. He specializes in this field, and he has an amazing website on the Brennan Center about CVE with a ton of links and a ton of informative resources. But without further ado, I introduce Mr. German to talk to us a little about CVE.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to come out here. Actually, my first office that I worked in when I joined the FBI was here in Santa Ana, and one of the first the first undercover investigation I was involved in was an investigation here in Orange County and Los Angeles involving white supremacist skinhead groups active in the aftermath of the Rodney King unrest. So it's nice to be back in Southern California, and I appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you, and wish it was about something that could be more helpful to your community. this concept, countering violent extremism, what they call CVE, is not something new. It's something that's been around for a while, and every time there is some problem abroad, this administration brings up CVE as the solution. So it first came up in the aftermath of the civil war in Somalia, when some Americans were traveling to Somalia to engage in that civil war. They brought up this concept of CVE, which it's problematic on a number of levels. So part of it is that it takes what a community policing strategy of community outreach, right, which is critically important. The police are public servants. They are here to serve the community, to address the community's security needs. So the only way the police can know what those security needs are is if they have good relationships with community organizations and people in the community, so they can understand what crime problem the community thinks is important for the police to address. Likewise, the only way they will understand that their enforcement activities are having a negative consequence, that they're doing something that's actually hurting the community, is if they have good relationships with the community. So they're taking this very essential part of how our government interacts with the citizenry, and particularly regarding the Muslim community, they're putting that in the context of counterterrorism. So they're suggesting that the reason we're doing outreach to the Muslim community is part of our anti-terrorism strategy, which is problematic in a number of ways. One, the idea of it is based on false premises. The first false premise being that terrorism is primarily a Muslim community problem, which we know it's not. I mean, I was here in the early 90s addressing terrorism that had nothing to do with the Muslim community, except as potential victims of this type of terrorism. So unfortunately, the way they have addressed this CVE issue with the Muslim community, rather than focus on broad communities and have outreach to all sorts of different groups, this countering violent extremism element is focused directly on the Muslim community. The second problem with the premise of it is that the way they talk about it is that, you know, the reason this community outreach is a good counterterrorism strategy is if we have good relationships with the community, they will tell us who the terrorists are. So it plays into this false theme that the terrorists are coming from the community and are part of the community, and that the community all knows who they are, and which again plays into these false theories that are out there that you hear in some of the more Islamophobic sort of reporting that comes out, unfortunately, both from government and from the media. So it's trying to address a problem that doesn't really exist, right? Because if you look at counterterrorism cases where acts of terrorism have been prevented, a significant portion of those, more than 40%, originated with a tip from the Muslim community. And this was according to research done at the University of North Carolina. So the idea that there is not cooperation with law enforcement within the Muslim community is false. We can prove that that's not true. So why would we need a specialized program to create this relationship? So it's sort of a program that doesn't really have a basis in its foundational premise is flawed. And there are a lot of government counterterrorism programs that aren't effective. That's the bulk of what I do in my work, is address the fact that we're spending a lot of money on programs that don't actually have a positive benefit. But I'm not a libertarian. I'm not an economist. I don't really care if the government wastes money. That's not my issue, because governments are designed to waste money. My issue with these programs is they also have a negative consequence for the community, and that negative consequence is multifaceted, right? One is very simple. that it reinforces this perception that it unfortunately has gained some traction in the public, that terrorism is something that comes out of the Muslim community, and that the Muslim community is somehow, number one, uniform, and number two, alien to American society. You know, I had a reporter call me about this CVE stuff, and he said, you know, excuse me, I understand your concerns with the program, but what are Muslims doing to stop terrorism? And I said, well, you know, which Muslims are you talking about? Are you talking about the Muslims that are in the army? Because it's pretty clear what they're doing, or the Muslims that are in the Department of Homeland Security, or the Muslims that are in the FBI, or the Muslims that are prosecutors, or the Muslims that are defense attorneys, the Muslims that are doctors. You know, it's this weird framing that suggests that the community is somehow separate from the rest of American society, and makes it easier for those who would argue an Islamophobic point of view that this is a community that we need to treat with suspicion. And that this CVE program is designed to reach out to them to try to convince them to cooperate with law enforcement. So it's flawed that way. The other way it's flawed, and again, none of this is new. A lot of the programs that we're seeing now are very similar to a program that was started in Britain called Prevent. And parts of the way that program worked were multifaceted. One was that there was an intelligence gathering component to it. So part of the community outreach was intended to actually gather information about the community. And we saw that modeled here. When I was at the ACLU, we did a Freedom of Information Act request that got FBI documents that showed in Northern California what was happening at community outreach events to the Muslim community were being recorded in FBI files with information about the participants, their religious practices, their travel, you know, sort of the normal conversations that you would have when you're interacting with somebody in a social situation. But these were appearing in FBI files that, by their numerology, I could tell from my past experience were intelligence files, and clearly the fact that the ACLU could get these from the FBI through Freedom of Information Act, that these were retrievable, right? So this was intelligence about everyday, ordinary people in the Muslim community who went to interact with their government officials, all of a sudden ending up in intelligence files at the FBI, and in some cases, according to the documents, disseminated beyond the FBI to who knows where, whether that's the intelligence agencies or local law enforcement, it's unclear. But this is what raised concerns, was that these US programs are modeling this very flawed program in the United Kingdom. The other thing the United Kingdom program did was basically focus using this very flawed theory of terrorist radicalization. And you know, I've been studying terrorism since 1992 when I was asked to go undercover in terrorist groups. And I wish that there was an easy explanation for how somebody becomes a terrorist. But unfortunately, with millions and millions of dollars spent on research, the fact is it's not true. There's no specific pattern, there's no profile, there are no strong indicators of who might become a terrorist. It's not about people who were alienated from the community. Oftentimes, the people who become terrorists were very popular within their communities and integrated and educated. But that also is not a pattern, because for everyone you can show that was highly educated, you can show somebody who didn't have any education at all. For everyone you could show was poor, you could show one that was rich. It's a complex problem. It's, as somebody who is concerned about security and terrorism, I would love to be able to say, here is the pattern, here's how you tell somebody who is on the path to being a terrorist. And as much as I would like that to be true, it's simply not. But rather than accept that reality and work within it, the law enforcement community invented this theory. And this theory was a very simplistic four-step theory on how people become terrorists. And they start by adopting an ideology. So in the case of Muslim extremism, basically becoming a Muslim makes you part of the category from which people become terrorists. And unfortunately, the way the FBI model worked, which was later copied by the NYPD, indicators of increasing religiosity were listed as indicators of increasing dangerousness. So things like wearing Muslim dress, things like praying more often, things like growing beards, unfortunately. Sorry. But you can't help yourself, because in other models, shaving off your beard is an indicator. So, and it would be silly, except this is what was being trained to law enforcement, and this is what some of them still believe. So there were two elements to it. One was increasing religiosity, and the other is participation in Muslim social organizations or political activities. So what I see with these programs, and this was particularly true in the Prevent program, is that it's almost specifically designed to treat increasing religiosity and increasing political participation on interests of Muslim communities as indicators of dangerousness. So the effect it has is to suppress that activity, right? And certainly I think the communities that I go to talk to, I don't think it's a big surprise that there is some concern about having political discussions about controversial issues, about U.S. policy, about U.S. counterterrorism policy, about foreign policy, without fearing that some of your comments and concerns might be taken out of context and treated as something that is inappropriate, which in American society should never be the case, right? We should feel completely free to discuss our concerns about anything. In the UK, there's a great report that their parliament did in 2010 that says this program was a complete disaster. It divided the community by providing money to groups that the government had deemed the good groups that had the right interpretation of Islam. They alienated other groups, and they made those groups that did sort of fall under the government's approved agenda, made them sort of alien from the rest of the community as well, because they were then seen as government propagandists rather than people who were actually representing the entire community. So it had this incredibly divisive impact on the community, didn't help solving any terrorism cases, and was something that in 2010 Parliament said this is something we really should stop doing. They haven't completely stopped doing it, they revamped it quite a bit, but then it came over the pond and the US government said, hey, let's implement this here. It works so well in Britain, let's do this here. And unfortunately, with the history of the FBI's exploitation of community outreach for intelligence purposes, there were already significant concerns. So what we have is examples, and for some reason it was interesting when this came up again anew. There was an event that national security advisor Lisa Monaco gave a speech at in Boston at the anniversary of the Boston Marathon. Again, sort of focused on Muslim terrorism, where they said they were going to create a new Department of Homeland Security CVE envoy position. So many of the groups working on these issues reached out to the Department of Homeland Security. We wrote a letter saying, hey, there's this really problematic terrorism radicalization theory that drives a lot of really bad police activities. We want to make sure as you implement this new program, you're looking at studies that have a strong social science foundation and empirical basis for their conclusions and not these flawed theories. Could you please tell us how you're basing this program? And we got no information back. Nothing, no response at all.
Could you explain what you mean by empirical?
Sure, fact-based, right? Which is funny to me as a former FBI agent, because all investigations should be fact-based, right? You want to make sure that you're gathering facts, you're interpreting those facts accurately and objectively before you make decision. So that is basically what we want to see with terrorism research, right? We want it actually based on fact, not people's opinions about how things work, not people's guesses, but actually based in factual evidence.
Mike, can I just stop
Sure.
you for a second? I'm getting text messages. Some people are kind of getting lost.
Okay.
So, could you just put in layman's terms,
Yeah.
what is the CVE program? How is it supposed to work?
Okay.
So that just
Right.
generally can set that framework.
Right. So this is what then gets us here. So it's this long, torrid history, and I'm sorry it was a little hard to follow. So in September of this year, Attorney General Eric Holder, after the Department of Homeland Security wouldn't respond to our request for information, said, we're starting a brand new CVE program that will have pilot, basically a test project in 3 cities, in Boston, in Minneapolis, and in Los Angeles. And that was basically it. And so again, everybody started reaching out saying, wait a minute, is this the same as the DHS Envoy program? And nobody seemed to have any understanding of what this new program is. And they sort of scrambled to try to put together this White House summit by taking these programs that already existed in these cities and then putting them under the umbrella of CVE. But it's still, to this day, it's very unclear what exactly these programs are and who's running them, right? Under this system, they are being run by the U.S. Attorney's Office, although a lot of the work on the ground is being done by the LAPD and other state and local agencies. And it's unclear what the FBI's role in these programs are. So it's very confusing as to what it is. But what I think hopefully I can provide to you is what the problems were with the previous programs. So if you know how these previous programs were abused, hopefully you can, in your interactions with the government, encourage them to make sure that as they implement a new program, they are addressing these concerns. So one of the troubling things to me is the government is very reluctant to admit that their previous community outreach efforts were for the purposes of intelligence gathering, even though at the ACLU we published hundreds of documents showing this was true. Recently, at the Brennan Center, we released 2 documents about the Minneapolis program. One was an FBI document, which was the creation of the 2009, what they called the SCOT program, the Somali Community Outreach Team. And in that, it established that the team would consist of community outreach representatives who do the normal outreach the FBI does, but then intelligence analysts and even behavioral scientists who would then assess the community individuals for their risk, what risk they posed, which is troubling because, as I mentioned, there aren't good indicators, right? So take it out of the context of terrorism, and you look at, there are oftentimes the government is trying to assess the risk, right? Somebody's arrested, and a judge has to determine if they get bond, if they should be back out on the street. And what we find in those cases is the judges and the pretrial services are not really very good at determining who is going to be a future threat, right? That's very difficult for anybody, right? If we all had a crystal ball, we could tell who is going to be a threat in the future, but unfortunately we don't, and we are unable to predict future behavior. Psychiatrists also come across this problem where they're dealing with somebody who has problems, and they have an obligation to the rest of the community that if they know somebody is a threat to the community, they have to report that to police. But even where that's true and they do, like the Colorado theater shooter, right? That psychiatrist did report that person to the police, but there's not really a way to say, okay, we know because this person is this way, they will become a threat in the future. It's just very difficult. So the idea that you could have brief sessions with the community and have the community then be the ones that are supposed to be assessing their fellow community members for their potential dangerous in the future is pretty specious. And unfortunately, what it will lead to, because again, if you look at those radicalization theories the government has published, they identify things that have nothing to do with potential violence, like your religious practices, like your political activities. So the people that will be reported aren't people who are real threats. The police will investigate them anyway and waste a lot of resources because they're working off of flawed models. So this program, as it goes forward, I'm 100% in favor of community outreach. I think community outreach is essential, but there should be complete transparency about whether those programs are collecting intelligence about the community members who participate, and how the information gathered at these events is being used, because we know that there's a history of misusing them. In Minneapolis, there was this Scott program that, again, said a potential purpose of it was to do analysis of the community. A local police program there, the St. Paul Police, got a grant from the federal government to do community outreach, where one of the things that they were supposed to do under this grant was create a database of at-risk youth that they identified through the outreach program. So they claim now that they didn't actually do that, which is kind of interesting, because I also used to work a lot of government fraud, and if you accept government money to do something and then don't do it, they have a word for that. So it's sort of hard for me to understand how they would have accepted money to do this and then not done it. Similar with the FBI, as they say now that, oh, I know on paper it says that we were going to do intelligence gathering and assessment of the community, but we didn't actually do that. But unless they acknowledge what they've done in the past and explain how they are going to put guidelines on these new programs and have the transparency and oversight to make sure they're not being abused, it's very difficult then for the community to have trust in these programs. That's a good question.
You want to start taking questions now?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay.
So the question was, how is the outreach going to take place? And I don't think we've ever gotten a straight answer for that. And this is a big part of the problem, because anytime there's a problematic program, like, we found this program the FBI did in Northern California, the LAPD and the FBI in Minneapolis and Boston say, well, that's not our program. So we had nothing to do with that program. It had nothing to do with us, so you can't hold that against us. And when we found out about the program with the local police in Minneapolis supposedly having a database, DHS said, that's not our program. And it's this sort of bait and switch where, for members of the community, they have a representative from the federal law enforcement community and a representative from the local law enforcement community. How are they supposed to know which program they're interfacing with, and whether this is the program that has the appropriate guidelines, or is this some other program? Because one of the things that we saw in the Northern California documents is it really pretty fascinating. So in 2009, the Community Outreach Office of the FBI, which is part of their Office of Public Affairs, recognizes that our effort to build trust in the community is going to be undermined if it's exploited for intelligence. So they did something very proactive. They said, okay, any information we gather, because of course they have to gather information, right? They get the names of the community leaders who they call to set up the events. They routinely collect people's phone numbers. Oh yes, we can talk about that, trade business cards. But they put that in a separate database that wasn't accessible by the other agents. So they took proactive measures, and they should be given credit for that. The problem was the FBI's intelligence division created their own community outreach. and would use the invitations of the community outreach people to have intelligence agents at the community outreach events. So even though the community outreach people were not collecting the information, the intelligence people were, and there was no way for the community to understand, oh, this is a person who's coming to community outreach to say hello to me and earn my trust. That person is a person here who's going to be collecting information about what I say, right? So, as these programs move forward, I think it's incumbent upon the government officials that are putting them forth to be transparent. Number one, to be accountable for these other programs and to be transparent about how they are going to ensure their new programs don't suffer the same problems as the old ones as they move them forward. I mean, I think the fundamental problem is the concept is flawed, right? I mean, if you're only addressing your community outreach to the Muslim community as a counterterrorism measure as opposed to as a good government measure, right? I mean, the government is responsible for serving many of our social needs, including solving crimes and addressing other social problems in the community. But if they say the reason we're doing it is so you won't become terrorists, that creates a stigma that the rest of the Los Angeles community will say, oh, if the government thinks the Muslim community needs to be treated with kid gloves because they're suspect, we should think that too, and we should be careful around them. My other problem with the way they're implementing it, the University of Maryland has a terrorism studies program, and one of their researchers based out of Illinois is actually researching the LA CVE program. So his report should be out in the summer, but what they call a research brief, a 2-page summary of his findings is out. And one of the things that he says the LAPD's, well, I shouldn't say it's the LAPD, it's the LA model, includes the LAPD and other government agencies, but it says that one cornerstone product of the CVE initiative is to assess at-risk individuals. So even though they're calling it community outreach, it's an assessment of the people that participate to try to determine which ones are at risk or vulnerable to recruitment by terrorists. And again, there aren't very good models for any accurate guess, and what it leaves is a lot of room for people saying people are dangerous because they're already suspicious of them for biased reasons rather than for appropriate reasons. You got to follow up.
So to keep things...
He just had a follow-up, though.
Yeah. So we'll just, so what we're going to do, just to keep things fair, we're going to actually form a single file line in the center here. So if anyone does have a question, please just make a line right here. Brother Ahmed is going to, just turn on your mic. Just hold it down. So he's going to be holding the microphone, and if everyone's going to get an opportunity to go ahead and ask their questions. If you have a follow-up or if you want to ask a second question, please just go back to the back of the line, and you can go ahead and ask your question again. Okay? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Sure.
Real quick question. What are some of your thoughts on how to implement an effective program that does meet the the objective of what the government is trying to do, but at the same time too is not breaking any rights or anything like that? Thank you.
So I think that that there needs to be outreach decoupled from an anti-terrorism purpose, right? It's the government's obligation to serve this community just like it serves every other community. And to where there are resources needed to address social issues, those resources should be available. It shouldn't have to be through the police, right? It shouldn't be the federal prosecutor being the one that says, oh, your community deserves a youth center, or that there needs to be more mental health facilities in this community because other communities have a higher concentration of those facilities, and your community should get them as well. You know, that is entirely appropriate for the government to do, but putting it through a securitized lens creates a stigma that I think is very difficult to get rid of, right? Because, you know, particularly in Minneapolis, the Somali community there has a lot of social needs, but they shouldn't have to agree to participate in a program where they're allowing their community members to be assessed by law enforcement through these flawed models in order to get those social services. It shouldn't be a trade-off. As far as effective counterterrorism, it's always fascinating to me when I hear that regular traditional law enforcement isn't effective counterterrorism, because that's what I did, right? These were proactive cases. I went undercover into groups that were making and exploding bombs. You know, that's what the government should focus on. They should focus on people who actually have weapons and intent to do harm. And it's not a very difficult approach where it's based on reasonable suspicion, right? I used to train young agents, and I would say, you know, if you can't sit down with a piece of paper and explain why this person you're going to open an investigation of, why you believe they're doing something illegal, and how you're going to be able to solve that criminal activity, there's probably somebody worse out there, right? You know, half of the violent crime in this country doesn't get solved. Did you know that? A third of the murders in the U.S., murders, don't get solved every year. 60% of the rapes in this country don't get solved. So, you know, these are people who are doing harm in the community, who have done harm in the community, and yet they're still running around, and all these resources are going into these flawed studies and these flawed programs that don't actually make anyone safer and make the Muslim community less safe, because now they have to be concerned about these other things.
I got permission to actually ask this. The Los Angeles framework of CVE that's published by the U.S. Attorney's Office that was supposedly done with community input. Could you please comment on that, what that is, and why that might be good or bad, et cetera?
So it's been interesting. I have been engaged in this, you know, like I said, long before this recent iteration, but certainly very aggressively since Eric Holder made this announcement in September. In February, they finally published this framework for the program that he announced before, and I think they were very careful. You know, they know very well the criticisms that the Brennan Center and others have made, so they were very careful to use language that was not going to draw a lot of fire. But interestingly, in that document, even though it sets up a system of law enforcement outreach and they call it intervention, where the idea is through this outreach, the community will be empowered to identify people who are at risk and channel them into interventions, which are a little nebulous what they are, but it involves some mental health training, it involves some social services. But later in the document, they admit there is no sound research about what the indicators are. So who is it that we as a community are going to be channeling it into the intervention, right? If you don't have effective indicators, who gets sent into the intervention programs, and who among them then gets referred to law enforcement? And, you know, unfortunately, the community is well aware that the FBI in particular, but other law enforcement agencies as well, have been very aggressive about surveillance, informants, sting operations, those sort of things. So, you know, the worst situation would be that, you know, teachers and social services providers are using this framework the government has created with these false indicators and channeling the community's youth into these programs that have no research basis to believe they could actually work, right? I mean, we would all love to think that we could go up to the next Tamerlan Tsarnaev and just explain that he's wrong, right? But there's no research to believe, and certainly no empirical evidence to believe that that's an effective methodology, right? That he would listen, you know, I mean, I worked, like I said, white supremacists here in the United States. I could go to the skinhead groups that are out there today and say, you know, I'm white, you're white, I think you're wrong. I don't think they would give up their ideology because I disagreed with them, right? It's not something that is, you know, that all they need is a strict talking to and they become good again. So it's sort of based on this very flawed methodology. And then if as a community we do engage and implement these programs, what happens when inevitably they will fail because the people who are doing these things aren't well integrated into the community and part of the community, right? There's a reason we call them extremists, is because they are extreme. They're at the outer edge. They're not part of the community dialogue. They're not part of the community experience. They're alienated from it.
So even prior to the CVE program, I mean, there has been profiling going on. I mean,
Sure.
There's profiling going on in social media, there's profiling going on in campuses, and we have seen that much more happened in 2009 and 2010. So this program rolling out now, does this mean that the government has just figured out a way of getting the community engaged, are doing this sort of shady program that was being done prior CEV under the aegis, under the auspices of the community elders?
Right.
Right? I mean, is this an umbrella, or is this like putting a facade there, getting the people doing the same stuff,
Right.
but with a nice name, and
Right.
you're informing people beforehand with the same consequences?
Right.
And it's not like a substance abuse that you are going to reform the individuals, just as you said. And this is extremism, so what kind of laws are going to be applicable?
Right.
And what are the ways that an individual can take recourse in terms of Freedom of Information Act when he becomes a subject or one of this potential risk or threat,
Right.
based on the rankings?
Right. So a program that's based on the same flawed theory of radicalization and terrorist behavior is the Suspicious Activity Reporting Program, right? And this is a program that basically, again, sounds good. Of course, we want everybody to report something that's actually suspicious, and you know, certainly if anybody in the community thinks there's somebody in the community who is going to harm somebody else, they tend to report that to law enforcement, to responsible authorities. So they call it the Suspicious Activity Program, but then they describe what is suspicious, and in their original iterations, it included things like photography. It included all sorts of very innocuous behaviors. And sure enough, now that some of the suspicious activity reports are out, it's clear that it's not that the behavior is suspicious, but that the person who is reporting is suspicious of that person, right? So one of the interesting ones, and the ACLU of Northern California obtained these through FOIA. One of them was a Middle Eastern appearing male buying large quantities of water, reported to law enforcement and then put in file, you know, with some identifying information. And, you know, when I was with these extremist groups, I was with them making a lot of bombs, and I learned a lot of different ways to make bombs, but I never heard of a bomb made of water, right? It's not a very effective method of making a bomb. So clearly there's nothing suspicious about buying large quantities of water, you know, unless they thought that the new terrorist tactic was going to be to drown people or something. But they were suspicious of this person because they had a Middle Eastern appearance, and we see that over and over again. So similarly, this program, using the flawed model of what is suspicious, could lead to problems.
Wait, by the way, how come past programs have like, although they have been flawed, but how come they still move on the methods to newer programs?
Good question. Part of it, it's very political, right? You have these Islamophobic groups, these very, I don't think there's a better word than Islamophobic members of Congress who press the administration because they want to draw a connection between ideology and violence, right? This concept of radicalization is not new. Everybody remembers the radicalization hearings in Congress, right? 1917. That was the first radicalization hearing in Congress. It had to do with the fact that there was quite a bit of anarchist violence and labor unrest. And what the government tried to do was argue that those people that are seeking social justice and labor rights are just like the people who are blowing up bombs. And because they have the same goal, they must be in league with one another. And therefore, instead of looking at the people who are making bombs, we're going to go after the people who are on the streets advocating for social justice and labor rights. And that way they can suppress that political movement and alienate that political movement from the discourse. And so it's really no different than the way it's being played out now, where a lot of it is, and if you see the way they describe what is dangerous, often it's the expression of grievance against US policy. That's an indicator of dangerousness. So if they're coming into the community and saying, okay, we as the government can't monitor people's expression of dissent against US policy, but you community members can, because the Constitution doesn't apply to you. So we just want you to tell us when somebody is saying something against US policy. And that way, it somewhat like you said, it's just the proxy, that it's the community then, or the social services or the teachers who are involved in these programs who are basically serving that same function. And that's my concern, is that what this will do is suppress political discussions rather than empower the community to have these discussions and to participate fully in American democracy.
We got an online question here. Is it better that we as a community, meaning the Muslim community, that we self-regulate, somehow monitor people in our own community more so that the law enforcement won't actually do it for us?
I've been around the country talking about this and working on other issues that affect the Muslim community, and I've never been aware of one Muslim community, right? I mean, there are lots of very different Muslim communities, and the idea that they're all one monolithic community is simply factually not true, right? There are very wealthy Muslims in this country. There are not wealthy Muslims. There are very educated Muslims in this country. There are very people that haven't had a chance to have an education. So the idea that there is one community that has one voice and that all of you know each other across the country and know who the bad guys are, you just don't want to tell the government, is simply false. It's not true. So the idea that I had one of the researchers who promotes these radicalization theories in my office, and he happened to be white, and I said, he was talking about this same idea of what, the community has to have some responsibility for this. There's this collective responsibility, and I said, okay, how many white supremacists have you turned into the government? How come you're not policing your racial community? And that it sort of opened his eyes. Back in November, former Ku Klux Klansman killed 3 people at a Jewish center, right? Nobody went to the Christian churches and said, what are you doing to root out Ku Klux Klan in the Christian community? It's not part of their community. I've been to a lot of Christian churches, haven't seen many Klansmen there. Been to Klan rallies, didn't see a lot of Christians there. They call themselves Christians, they say they're Christians, they're reading the Christian Bible, but the idea that they're a part of the American Christian community is simply not true. And the idea that the regular Christian community could police the Ku Klux Klan is silly. You're talking about 2 different things, and it's no different here. There is no collective responsibility for individual acts. Unfortunately, no matter what your political inclinations are, what your religions are, there are people in the name of that political ideology or religious ideology who will do bad things. And The idea that I have responsibility, being raised Catholic, for things that Catholic priests do, it simply isn't true. I don't have any control over that. And certainly if I knew of somebody from any community who was doing harm to somebody else or threatening to do harm to somebody else, I would report them. None of us want to see anybody get hurt, but the idea that the Muslim community has collective responsibility for all the criminal acts of all the Muslims out there, it's just stigmatizing. It's not something that can actually work.
Great. Yeah, I'm interested in just hearing an FBI perspective on the Patriot Act. Do you think it's went too far? Pieces like Section 215, I know, is coming up for a very important vote. Do you think that should be extended? Do you think it's gone too far? And just interested to hear your take on that.
That's a great question. And to bring it into the context of this discussion, this CVE program is not happening in a vacuum. These other activities are still taking place, whether it's the Patriot Act surveillance, whether it's other law enforcement surveillance techniques, whether it's other investigative techniques. So, the idea that, well, if we did this CVE, all that would go away, there's no indication of that. It's not either or, right? These things exist, and we have to understand that the community is under stress. I mean, I haven't, even when I was at the FBI, I'm not sure I gave the FBI perspective. I mean, obviously, I left the FBI because I had concerns about those tactics, both that they were going to impact the rights and civil liberties of innocent people, but that they would be ineffective. And sure enough, when you look at the evidence, there's no positive effect from the 215 program. That's the program where all of our telephone data, who we call, when, how long, gets given to the government every day. Has never been helpful in stopping an actual terrorist plot. So if you have a program that's ineffective and negatively impacting people's privacy, you'd think that would be easy to get rid of, but unfortunately Congress has yet to restrict it.
Another online question. In the field of anti-terrorism, there appears to be significant funding driving that research, and you're familiar with a lot of this. So could you address how government funding, either positively or negatively, will actually affect this discussion of CVE and counterterrorism measures?
It's a huge part of the problem. And there are a lot of researchers out there that have written about this. And if you go to our website at the Brennan Center, we have a CVE resource page that includes a lot of links to the information. So, as much as I said, we would all love there to be a simple path that we could identify that all terrorists follow so that we could interdict them before they do harm. The truth is that despite years of research and millions of dollars poured into that research, it's not true. It's a very individualized thing. And, it makes sense, too. I mean, there's all sorts of different political issues involved. I used to say to police officers when I was still doing the counterterrorism training, give me the profile of how and why somebody becomes a police officer, right? For as many police officers there are, you're going to have that many stories. One guy went into it because his grandfather and his father was a cop. Another guy went into it, his parents weren't cops, they were actually criminals. Somebody went into it because it has a good pension. Somebody else went into it because they happened to meet a guy in a bar who said, hey, come take the test. They're giving a civil service test tomorrow and you could be a cop. So the idea that something as unregulated as terrorism would have a simple plot is wrong. But unfortunately, the government really wants that. And they keep funding this research designed to find that, and it's creating this glut of very poorly informed research showing poor methodology, not focused on the actual factual evidence that is promoting some of these bad acts. I mean, I'm from New York City, and I'm not sure how familiar you are, but I'm sure you heard the NYPD had a massive program where they were spying on the Muslim community, spying on not just mosques, but community centers, halal restaurants. I mean, it was just over the top. That was based on a academic study that was done for the NYPD that mimicked the FBI's 4 steps. You get the ideology, you become immersed in the ideology, you participate in social activities, in furtherance of the ideology, you become a terrorist. You know, so that if you see that model, of course it makes sense that you would surveil those communities, right? But if you knew that that model wasn't true, it would make no sense. And in fact, that program was not very effective in identifying actual terrorist plots.
How are you, sir?
Very good.
Thank you for coming.
Sorry. Grab the microphone.
Oh, sorry. I assume that you're FBI agent, so I was nervous now.
Former FBI agent.
Relax.
Yes.
Basically, I have a similar question. How would you assess how terrorism is staged in this country in relationship to the Middle East? And things are not becoming any easier or any really better.
Right.
And basically hate over there becoming bombs in this country and at the same time in those countries.
Right.
In Syria and Egypt, everywhere. Thank you.
So it's a great question, and this is again where a lot of the research is very flawed. In fact, far more Americans were killed in acts of terrorism in the decade of the 1970s than over the last 10 years, right? So we tend to think of this era as an era where there's a lot of terrorism, but it's actually much less than what the United States has experienced in history. So to the extent the problem has been aggrandized in a way that makes us very fearful when the facts don't reflect that, right? Of course, we are all concerned about terrorism. Of course, we want to stop it, but your chances of being murdered by a robber are far greater than by a terrorist. A lot of so for instance, the government is not very good about testing their methodologies. There's an organization at George Mason University called the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, and they actually try to evaluate programs that law enforcement has. And one of the things that they did was do what's called a Campbell collaboration study. So they looked at all the terrorism research, 20,000 research papers written on terrorism. Guess how many addressed the effectiveness of counterterrorism programs? 20,000 reports. 7, right? It turns out that metal detectors at airports do prevent skyjackings. So there's one thing that works. But no other methods that were tested actually showed positive effects. Military intervention to prevent terrorism was studied, and what it found is over the short term, terrorism goes up. So unfortunately, this has been the tool that the government keeps using, and you can't be surprised by the result. And unfortunately, we have this bipartisan consensus that U.S. military intervention is the answer to a lot of different problems, and what we see it creates is a lot of disarray and chaos in countries where we intervene. And that's true not just in the Middle East, but in South America as well, and Central America, where the U.S. has militarily intervened. It creates significantly more problems than it solves, and the idea that it's going to make things better, as we've seen, doesn't really work. And unfortunately, rather than acknowledging that, we seem to just perpetuate it. So again, it's because we're engaging in tactics that aren't based on sound research.
So,
I have been in this country for 34 years. If I ever have a chance, this country would be number one for me to come. I have been in this country for 34 years, and if I ever have a chance, this country would be number one.
Sure.
Thank you. The law enforcement seem to have been very successful in keeping track of the terrorism. At the same time, the situation in the Middle East is exploding. So it's not really helping anyone.
So if you look at the cases where terrorists were actually able to commit attacks, and the 9/11 Commission just put out a new report on this, what they describe is an influx of data that's like a tidal wave, right? They're collecting so much information, it's hard to manage it, and that the pieces that are important keep falling through the cracks, and that was true in the Boston Marathon bombing and the Fort Hood shooting. There's a case of a terrorist by the name of David Headley who participated in the Mumbai attacks. In many of these cases, these were people who were reported to law enforcement, often many times. With David Headley, 5 times people in the community reported him, including 2 ex-wives. And yet he was able to continue traveling abroad and engaging with foreign terrorist groups without the FBI responding to these reports. So the idea that what the FBI needs is more reports, what the law enforcement needs is more reports, is belied by the evidence.
Yeah, so question texted in, should, when I say the Muslim community, meaning our Muslim
Right.
community in Southern California, should the Muslim community in Southern California be involved in outreach with government organizations, and in what way, in what shape do you recommend that?
So I'm a big believer in outreach, and I'm a big believer in participation, that the community should be participating in these government decisions. This is your government, right? This is a democracy. They work for you. So I'm all in favor in engagement, and I think one of the problems with this CVE program is that the government and the people who are supporters of this program refer to the people who raise concerns about the program as disengagers. I've never been disengaged from the government. I've been quite engaged in the government, and many of them are unhappy that that's true. But I think it's very important to be engaged with the government. It's whether the government should treat its engagement as a counterterrorism issue rather than as a good governance issue. And so, I think it's important that we let the government know that this framing is damaging to the community. It's damaging to the community by perpetuating this false image of the Muslim community being a suspect community, but it's also damaging within the community by dividing it and creating hostilities between organizations over this issue that shouldn't be an issue.
Just before I get to the next question, sisters are actually allowed to ask questions, just to point that out.
So my question is,
By standing in line, the sisters. So any sisters who would like to ask a question, please also stand in line. You can have a separate line if you want. Sure.
so my question is, in your opinion, what do you think some of the long-term, or actually short-term and long-term effects or repercussions are of the CVE program to the community? I mean, looking back at history, we see certain situations where there's a climate that was created, such as maybe one that comes to mind, like in the Cold War. If you were to step off of the curb with your left foot, then you're considered a commie.
Right.
When Muslims, you step off the right foot, would you be considered a terrorist? Or
Right.
other situations where we find that, I guess, sometimes with like the military, and they're going after a specific terrorist, that their kill list just keeps larger and
Right.
larger and larger in the quest to go ahead and crush terrorism. So what is your opinion of the short-term and long-term effects of that program?
The short-term effect is that it divides the community against itself, right? And that we're already seeing that, where groups are arguing, maybe too kind a word, where it shouldn't be an issue, right? I mean, the government is responsible to all of us. This community shouldn't be treated different from any other community. As far as long-term, again, none of these tactics are new. So if you look at the way the government treated the civil rights groups during the civil rights era, a lot of the law enforcement activity, the putting informants in, was designed to divide the community. And what I would hope the community can do, despite the fact that it's many different communities, is that they could come together. And we're never going to agree on everything, but at least act as if we're a community that is working together for the good of all of us, rather than, you know, who are in the framing that the UK Parliament talked about with the Prevent program, that it was dividing good Muslims into bad Muslims. That the good Muslims were the ones who were participating in the programs, the bad Muslims were the ones who weren't. And if you look at the documents the government has produced on this theory, they talk about that we will be able to identify the suspects by their refusal to engage. And they then become the suspect community. So we create a community of people we trust and a community of people we don't. And that's part of the problem. So, you know, whether you're part of a group that agrees with engagement, you know, don't disparage the groups that don't. Don't treat them as disengagers, you know. They want to be engaged with the government just as much as everybody else. They just have opposition to being engaged with the government in an anti-terrorism program.
You'll hold it? I want to hold it myself. Thank you for coming. And early on, you kind of scared me. I mean, the Muslim community is already scared, and you kind of like.
Right, I'm sorry.
Some of your speech scared us more. But who's really guilty here? Is it the media outlets that, you know, betraying Islam and Muslims as the enemy, or the, you know, those law enforcement agencies that are trying to protect us and protect America? And I'm glad that, you know, you answered one of my questions as I was going down in line, that you are pro-engagement.
Right.
Which I think that the Muslim community should be engaged. Because a lot of the Muslim community leaders feel that we should shy away from those law enforcement agencies and not talk to them, not be engaged with them. And are you telling me really, if we have the director of the FBI here, you know, addressing the Muslim community, we have 5 FBI cars out, you know, taking notes and, you know, spying on us who's here and who's not, and, you know, is that really the case?
So the ACLU published the documents, and they're extremely troubling. You know, you know, an agent describes being invited into a mosque, and he's detailing in his FBI report where the women pray versus where the men pray. Why should that ever be in an FBI report, right? I mean, it has no bearing on anything. And you know, that a person was talking about how his daughter just got accepted at a university and is going to travel to Egypt. Why is that in an FBI report? You know, with the names of the people. So certainly when you engage with law enforcement, you have to understand that, I don't know how to, their purpose is always going to be law enforcement, right? They're the mission. The FBI is not made up of social workers. You know, they're not here to ensure that your children are getting their proper therapy, right? So, you know, to a certain extent, it's always going to be a law enforcement mission that brings them here. It's an appropriate law enforcement mission to have engagement with the community, to learn about community problems, and to understand how their programs are impacting the community. It's inappropriate to use that same thing and collect information that's accessible throughout the FBI and other agencies. So I would suggest that you go and look at the documents, because they're quite troubling as far as what was actually collected.
Some of the documents, or every documents are, I mean, is the law enforcement agencies are out there to get the Muslim community?
So at the right.
So you can answer it all, and then I can sit down. Is the law enforcement are out there just to, you know, go after the Muslim community and put them out, you know, just maybe kick them out of America?
No.
If the Muslim community don't get involved and, you know, seek change through
Right.
positive, through engagement, and, you know, make that change happen,
Right.
then what's the alternative?
So the law enforcement community is not a monolith. Your community isn't a monolith. The law enforcement community isn't a monolith, right? There are all sorts of people. And you know, the vast majority of them are people who went into law enforcement because they care about their community and they want to help it. Problem is, there is this cottage industry of bad terrorism training, right? And we saw how that crept into law enforcement training, where this very anti-Muslim biased training, anti-Arab training, was part of, you know, went from being, you know, a bunch of fringe organizations putting this material out to actually being produced in FBI training, in Department of Homeland Security training, in local law enforcement training, in military training, this horribly biased material. So that does have an effect. That exists within these agencies. So which agent will be the one that you're interacting with is hard to guess. So what you have to know is when you're interacting with law enforcement, everything you say can be used against you. And it can be misinterpreted, it can be, you misstated something, it could be something where you didn't think it was appropriate to talk to him about this issue, so you made up a story just to keep the conversation going. But any false statement could be used against you. And we know that the FBI is very aggressive in trying to recruit informants, and particularly informants in the community. So, in some innocuous, innocent interaction with some law enforcement agent, you could find yourself then being pressured to become an informant against the community. And I believe in engagement. I think it's necessary, but you have to also be wise and be informed and have legal counsel when you're doing that kind of interaction. Hope that helps.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you said you were an analyst or an operative, former FBI agent.
I was a former FBI special agent, so I was an agent. So I did criminal investigations.
Yes. Last September, the FBI director, Comey, he proposed a strategic plan to integrate his analysts and his agents. My question is, if that collaboration is not working, as far as I know,
Right.
Mueller has proposed it before Comey.
Right.
If they're not able to collaborate within their group as an agency, how is it expected for all the agencies to collaborate together, vice versa? It just doesn't seem something conducive.
It is a problem, and the 9/11 Commission just produced another report on FBI intelligence that basically made that same point, that despite the effort and the resources that have poured into trying to create this analytical capability, that there are still significant problems that are impeding their ability to be very effective at it. And it's based on a lot of things. I mean, I think one of the reasons why is because there is so much bad terrorism research out there that is infecting what the agents are dealing with. And to the extent that intelligence gathering includes gathering intelligence about innocent members of the community, I can understand why the investigators don't find that very useful, right? If I was, back doing my white supremacist investigation, if somebody came to me and said, hey, my Uncle Ernie is racist, just wanted you to know, it wouldn't be very helpful to me, right? I mean, if he's not engaged in criminal activity, the FBI shouldn't be interested in anything that they're doing. Unfortunately, those controls have been lifted, so now they can investigate people they don't have any basis of suspecting are actually involved in any illegal activity, which is what's creating a lot of the false positives that are burning so many law enforcement resources.
I have a comment and I have a question. Recently, I just got back from Syria not too long ago. I'm a Syrian. My comment is, always Muslim profiling backfire, and everybody knows that, and doesn't get any U.S. government agency the results they wanted. Always backfires.
Right.
This has been the issue. Secondly, why people will ask the people in office, question themselves, is the U.S. policy sufficient? They made a lot of mistakes. President Obama, the current president, made a lot of mistakes. But the U.S. government, they don't admit it. And now they are in a bigger issue to solve, to protect U.S. interests in and out. And they can't do it by themselves with all the resources they have it. And now they're reaching out to the civilians.
So what's the question?
Give me a little bit more time.
We need to get to the question. Please.
Give me more time, please. I just got back from Syria.
Right.
I was inside Syria. I got my family, wife and 2 kids, are a year and a half been under siege, okay? And all the U.S. promises they made, the red lines for Bashar al-Assad, how many red lines? People, they think from what they hear. You make promises, you don't deliver. People being killed every day, nobody moves. And now Muslim profiling always backfire. And
Brother, sorry, you're going to have to get to the question because we have other people who are still we're running out of time. So if you could please just go straight to the question.
Always, you have to look at what drives people to maybe to get recruited or to do any kind or any act of terrorism. And it's very simple and easy. And you know the
Right, and I think a big part of the problem is we're not having enough of that conversation, right? And I think that there is fear in the community about having that conversation and raising issues about the effectiveness of U.S. foreign policy in the region. And my concern with this program is that it would have the effect of suppressing that conversation by saying anybody who raises these concerns is potentially at risk or vulnerable to recruitment. You know, if you look at violence, governments commit a whole lot more violence often than terrorist groups do. So, you know, it has to be part of the discussion. You know, it's all this fear about Americans traveling abroad, and, you know, clearly we don't want any of our children getting wrapped up to any kind of conflict or violence, but it's been part of the American experience since there's been an America, right? Whether it was the Spanish Civil War, that Americans felt that there was an injustice being done by the government. In Spain, they went and volunteered with the Lincoln Brigades, you know, fighting with the Flying Tigers in China. You know, all sorts of conflicts. I grew up Irish Catholic during the 1970s when the Ireland troubles were happening, and there was a lot of American money that was going to fund one side in that conflict, actually both sides in that conflict. So, you know, the idea that there is something different about the Muslim community is just ignoring history, and we need to talk about it in the same way we would have talked about those previously. Understanding that there is a violent conflict that tends to draw people to it because there's injustice happening anytime. Right. I'm sure, yes. And I'm glad you were able to get your family out. So.
First of all, I'd like to applaud you for coming tonight and to being so transparent with us. I myself, I'm born and raised here, and I've raised 2 children here, and I've seen just growing stigmatism, just where it's becoming that all the attention is focused on the Muslims, and it's causing really more consequences. Instead of curing the problem, it's causing more hostility.
Right.
My question to you is, what steps are you doing to improve? You know, and going forward, what are you going to do to help decrease all this, you know, the informants and causing all this hostility among the Muslim community?
So the bulk of my work is in public education, and I speak to all kinds of different audiences about this issue. I work with the government agencies that are putting out these flawed reports. I criticize the reports and explain why they're methodologically flawed. I engage directly with law enforcement audiences on these issues. You know, I believe that dialogue ultimately will win out. You know, and I'm concerned that the intelligence community writ large, including the law enforcement community, is unfortunately not being aggressive enough in addressing these issues, and in particularly framing their programs in a way that don't do that kind of, that don't perpetuate that harm. You know, they're not solely responsible for it. Some other questioner had asked about the media. Certainly the media is sensationalist. There's a new book out this month by a UNC researcher named Christopher Bale. It's really a fascinating, he does media research. He doesn't know anything about counterterrorism. But he was interested in how these fringe anti-Muslim groups who nobody ever heard of before 9/11, all of a sudden were on CNN, all of a sudden were doing training at the FBI and had all of a sudden become part of the mainstream conversation. So he wrote a paper called The Fringe Effect. I think his book is called the same thing, because these were once fringe groups. How did they become part of the mainstream discourse? And he was very clever in the way he did it. He used anti-plagiarism software, and he took their press releases and then measured how they appeared in news articles. So what messages would get picked up. And basically what he found was messages of anger and fear were most likely to get picked up by the media. So again, it's the sensationalism of the media. You know, somebody like me who's saying, no, the problem's not as great as what you're suggesting. There are a lot of other things that we need to be concerned about. You know, this isn't a Muslim community problem. Terrorism comes from all sorts of different communities. That's not the message that is sensationalist that they want to have on TV with this 24-hour news cycle. So it's harder to bring messages of restraint into the media, unfortunately. So, you know, obviously the media isn't going to change. They're a business. They're going to stick to their business model. You can expect politicians to exploit that cycle of fear and anger. Who is it in the government that's going to stop it? It really should be the intelligence community, right? They don't work for policymakers, they work for us. And they should be providing not just policymakers, but the public accurate and objective information about the threats we face, rather than participating in this cycle of fear-mongering and exploiting that for their own benefits, for their own budgets. So I've been very aggressive in working with them to try to convince them that it's their responsibility to start managing this research in a way that's more effective.
These will be the last two questions. If we keep them very, very short, please.
All right, two-part question. They're short.
Short two-part question.
First part is, what can a community member do if he or she falls victim to these programs? And part two is, what kind of actions can each individual do in order to promote, you know, a better living environment in the United States?
So as far as what to do if you fall victim to some improper law enforcement activity, you know, there are a number of groups out there, both community groups like CARE and broader civil rights groups like the ACLU, Muslim advocates, you know, local, you know, getting a lawyer involved as soon as possible will give you the best chance of coming to a positive outcome. As far as individuals, you know, this is a citizen-owned government, and, you know, raise your voice, organize, work with like-minded groups. You know, interestingly, this radicalization theory is not only having a negative impact on the Muslim community, the environmental rights community is also suffering from it. That the government has this flawed theory that people who have these, you know, strong environmental rights beliefs are the pool from which environmental rights terrorists come from. And even though, you know, no environmental rights terrorist has ever actually killed somebody, the FBI designated them the #1 domestic threat. So, you know, again, there's a lot of this hyperbole and a lot of aggressive law enforcement surveillance and investigative activity using the same sort of informant-driven sting operations and those sorts of things. So there are larger communities out there that will work with the Muslim community in addressing this overreach by law enforcement. So I would ask you to reach out to those groups in solidarity to try to push back and to compel our government representatives to represent our interest and to respond to our concerns.
Hi, I understand about the freedom of this country, the freedom of speech, and to tell what you want to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, I know your freedom stops whenever you're going to hurt someone else.
Absolutely.
So as an American citizen and as Muslim, to wake up in the morning to watch the news, and then all I hear about Muslims and terrorists, and the word terrorist always associated with Muslim, what the government are going to do to that media that always try to put that hate in the people's mind and talking about them. As you know, was the past 2 months or 3 months, there is few cases of Muslims who got shots in their own home while they're putting fuel in their cars, on the street while they're going to work. Yet the only thing we heard that somebody did it because of parking issue or some other cases. But they
So
did
what
not
can the
say
government do to
instead
help?
of like why whenever the Muslims or supposedly it's Muslims who do something, the
Right.
media Russian says it's Muslim and it's jihadi and
Okay.
it's terrorist.
Right.
Exactly.
But whenever someone else doing it, the government give or the media rush to say, oh, it's just a case, regular
Right.
case. It's
Okay.
a hate.
I
It's a
think
problem between two people.
He's got it.
So you know, I believe that the answer to speech we don't like is more speech, right? We raise our own voices and call out those voices of bigotry, whether they're, you know, people that the media is putting up or whether they're in the government. And, you know, I think we have a right to expect our government to have policies that are based on empirical research and sound social science methodologies. And a part of that is educating ourselves. And that's why I appreciate you all coming here to understand what these issues are. You know, we have a website at the Brennan Center devoted to this issue, so please feel free to look on that. Feel free to reach out to me if there's a question. There are good people right here in the community who are very informed on these issues. So, you know, the information is out there. We just have to seek it, and then we have to make sure our government is paying attention to it.
The
So,
last
thanks
question
again.
actually is how can we make sure that the Muslims go home tonight, and other people in the Southern California community, they don't go home with like a sense of fear that, you know, this is all going. What advice can you give us so that we don't just become afraid and we just want to avoid everything?
And I appreciate that, and I know you raised the same thing about the fear, and I always feel bad about that because, you know, I want to empower you. I want to give you information that you can then make better informed decisions with, not to be afraid, because I feel it's the lack of information that drives inappropriate fear. You know, at the same time, you need to be afraid of things you really need to be afraid of. So, you know, it's a matter of education to make sure that we're concerned about the things that we have a need to be concerned about and not overly concerned about things that we don't need to be concerned about. So, you know, continue to seek information, continue to work with the community leaders that are engaged on these issues, seek out various viewpoints and make up your own mind. You know, that's how this marketplace of ideas we have in this country finds the best ideas, and these extremist ideas will fall from their own lack of validity. You know, as far, I'm sorry, your first question was? So the other thing is again, this isn't the first time this has happened. You know, this is the same model that was used during the civil rights era, same model that was used during the labor rights era. So there are organizations out there, the NAACP, other civil rights organizations that have strategies, that have connections, because they've been able to come to weather this storm and come out to you know, it's still a struggle, as we've seen just recently with some of these police shootings. But, you know, they will work with this community and make sure that all of our rights are protected, because that's really what it's about and what a government program designed to empower communities should be doing. But it's up to us to actually make sure that we are doing things that help not just our community, but every community. Okay, thank you very much for coming, and I appreciate all your questions.